Tonight's stories come from deep in the wilderness, remote forests, isolated campsites, and places that left experienced campers questioning what they heard and what they saw. From unexplained screams in the woods to footsteps circling tents and a glowing red orb deep in the Canadian wilderness. These are three true camping stories that still haunt the people who lived through them. I grew up camping and I have so many memories as a child of camping and even into my teenage years. And I've camped as an adult as well. And there's just something about camping. It brings back summer memories, which I thought this would be a good time to share these stories. But also, there's something a little bit vulnerable about camping. We're outdoors, we're in structures that are not solid necessarily. And we never know what's out there in the woods. So these stories tonight all relate to people who had creepy experiences in the woods. On the northern stretches of Vancouver Island, far beyond the tourist towns and paved highways, there are forests so old and dense they almost feel untouched by time. Massive old growth trees tower over abandoned logging roads, and scattered throughout the region are tiny former mining and lumber towns, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. Tonight's first story comes from Patrick. Years ago, Patrick and five friends headed deep into the forests near the Salmon River area for a camping trip. All of them were experienced outdoorsmen. They had spent years camping in remote parts of British Columbia, and they had seen plenty of strange things in the bush before. Anything from sketchy people on logging roads, unexplained noises in the woods, strange flashes in the sky, and even close encounters with wildlife. But everything they had experienced before still had some kind of explanation. This experience did not. The group had driven deep into the forest off an old logging road and set up camp for the night. It was a dry trip because one of their friends was staying sober, so nobody had been drinking or smoking. They were simply sitting around the fire talking while the sounds of the forest filled the darkness around them. Frogs croaked in the distance, birds called occasionally through the trees. It was the normal soundtrack of the woods that surrounded them. One of Patrick's close friends suddenly went silent. He sat upright and tilted his head slightly, like he was listening for something. Then he quietly told everyone to stop talking. The entire group fell silent. That was when they realized the forest sounds were gone. Not quieter, they were gone. Patrick would later say it was one of the most unsettling silences he had ever experienced. Moments earlier, the woods had been alive with sound, but now there was absolutely no sound at all. There were no frogs, insects, no wind, nothing except the soft crackling of the fire. The friend who noticed it first worked in the forestry and spent nearly half the year alone in the bush for his job. Out of everyone there, he knew the woods better than anyone, and the expression on his face immediately alarmed the group. He quietly warned them that there could be a cougar or bear nearby. Predators can sometimes silence an entire forest, and he suggested they might want to move toward the vehicles just in case. Before anyone could react, something appeared deep within the tree line, roughly 100 feet away. At first, Patrick thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Then all six of them saw it clearly, a glowing red orb moving slowly through the trees. It wasn't a reflection, it wasn't headlights, and it wasn't shining from something else. The thing produced its own light. Patrick described it as looking almost like a glass sphere the size of a beach ball filled with fire. It flickered softly as it moved between the trees at about walking speed, passing both behind and in front of the trunks in a way that made it impossible to mistake for distant lights or vehicle beams. The forest around it was thick with brush and undergrowth. If a person had been moving there, they would have heard branches snapping or bushes rustling, but there was no sound at all. The orb simply drifted silently through the woods. As Patrick stared at it, he felt something he still struggles to describe years later. He felt pure fear. Not ordinary fear, not adrenaline, it was something deeper. He later admitted that he nearly died in an unrelated incident years afterward, and somehow that experience didn't terrify him as much as seeing that light in the forest. It felt, in his words, like his brain was trying to process what he was looking at and simply couldn't. The silence around them only made it worse. Patrick said it felt as if the air itself had been pulled out from the forest. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears while every instinct in his body screamed that they were in danger. The orb continued to move for maybe 20 seconds before it slowly faded out of existence. Then, about 10 seconds later, the sounds of the forest suddenly returned. There were frogs croaking, birds chirping, and wind through the trees. Everything normal again. But nobody at the campsite felt normal anymore. The group sat frozen for several moments before finally exchanging nervous, stunned reactions. "What the hell was that? Did you see that too?" All six of them confirmed that they had seen the same thing. At first, they decided to investigate, hoping there would be some logical explanation nearby that would make the experience less disturbing, but there wasn't. The deeper they looked into the area, the worse the feeling became. Finally, driven almost entirely by instinct, they packed up and left the campsite altogether sometime around 1 in the morning. About 20 or 30 minutes away, they found a paid campsite with other people around and stayed there for the rest of the night. Patrick barely slept. For weeks afterward, he suffered nightmares about the experience. Even years later, talking about it still unsettles him badly. The strangest part was how deeply it affected the friend who worked in forestry. According to Patrick, the man was genuinely shaken by what happened and avoided talking about it afterward because just thinking about it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. For months, he was nervous about returning to work alone in the bush. The following morning, the owner of the paid campsite stopped by to check in on them. Since people rarely arrived that late at night, she asked what happened. Patrick and his friends awkwardly explained the story, half joking because even saying it out loud sounded ridiculous. But the woman's expression immediately changed. Her face went completely serious. She explained that the forests in that area were ancient, old growth, that stories like theirs were not uncommon. She asked several questions about the location before telling them the land they camped on was technically indigenous territory. According to her, they weren't supposed to camp there without permission from the local tribal leaders. Patrick later spoke to his uncle, who is indigenous himself, and heard something similar. His uncle suggested it might have been some kind of evil shaman spirit or something tied to the land itself, though he admitted he truly didn't know either. Patrick doesn't claim to understand what they saw. Over the years, he searched constantly for explanations, and at one point, he considered whether it could have been ball lightning, but he eventually dismissed that idea. He spent plenty of time in the forest during storms and knew the strange feeling that the atmosphere gets before lightning activity. This felt completely different. The orb had been too controlled, it was too uniform and deliberate. More than anything else, Patrick came away from this experience believing that the land itself holds energy, especially places as ancient as the forest near the Salmon River. He later wondered whether the area might have once been near burial grounds or locations significant to the indigenous communities that had lived there for thousands of years before written history existed. Still, he claims he has no real explanation. He's spent long stretches of time alone in the remote wilderness his entire life and has encountered plenty of frightening situations before, but nothing ever made him feel the kind of primal terror he experienced the moment that the red orb appeared silently between the trees. Even now, when Patrick talks about this for too long, the nightmares sometimes come back. So, does anyone out there have any ideas about this? This is Vancouver Island, British Columbia, uh, camping area near the Salmon River and, the red orb. Anybody ever seen anything similar to that? Anybody out there from Canada? If you are or you've seen something, please leave it in the comments and let Patrick know what you experienced. Deep in the mountains of the George Washington National Forest, which stretches across parts of western Virginia and eastern West Virginia, there are places that seem untouched by time. Endless gravel roads twist through dense woods, streams cut through steep valleys, and once the sun goes down, the silence can feel almost unnatural. So this story was shared by someone who I believe wanted to remain anonymous, so we're just going to call him Mike for the sake of the story. So about 4 years ago, Mike headed into the forest alone for a biking and camping trip near Reddish Knob. He spent most of the day riding trails and gravel roads until the sun had already started setting by the time he stopped to eat. A cold, misty rain had rolled in, and the early October air had that damp mountain chill that settles deep into your clothes. Mike didn't have a reserved campsite. He just knew that there were a few dispersed camping spots somewhere along the gravel road leading toward Reddish Knob. Eventually, he found one tucked beside a small river, about a mile and a half or two from the turnoff that headed up the mountain. The site itself was simple: fairly open ground, several tall trees, and thick brush lining the edge of the clearing near an old fence line. Nothing immediately strange about it. He had a tent with him, but exhaustion won out, and instead of setting it up, he decided to sleep in the back of his car. At first, the night felt peaceful. He sat beside a small fire with quiet music playing from his phone while rainwater dripped from the leaves overhead. Beyond the crackling fire, the only sounds were the nearby stream and the occasional patter of water falling from the trees. And then the feeling started. Mike would later describe it as something that slowly built the longer he stayed there. The atmosphere around the campsite began to feel dark. Not dangerous exactly, but wrong. Like the place itself carried a weight to it. He kept catching himself turning around, suddenly convinced someone was standing behind him watching him from the trees. But every time he looked, there was nothing there. There were no footsteps or movement, and he couldn't hear any sounds in the brush. Eventually, the feeling got strong enough that he climbed into the back of his car and he locked the doors. He tried to sleep, but every time he drifted off for 30 minutes or so, the same overwhelming sense of being watched would jolt him awake again. The windows had fogged over from the cold and moisture outside, making it nearly impossible to see into the darkness. Any time he tried to shine a flashlight through the glass, the beam just reflected right back at him. Several times during the night, he got out of the car and walked around the campsite looking around with a light. He saw nothing. There were no animals or people. It was just silence there. By sunrise, Mike had packed everything up and left, relieved to be out of there. The experience bothered him enough that afterward he bought a weapon specifically for future camping trips. He said being alone in the woods that night made him realize how vulnerable someone can feel out there. But that wasn't the part of the story that stayed with him. 2 or 3 years later, Mike returned to the area with his girlfriend for another biking and camping weekend. They originally hoped to camp higher up near Reddish Knob, but the forest was unusually crowded because a 100-mile mountain bike race had just finished that day. Campsites were full everywhere they looked. After driving around for a while, they finally settled on a dispersed site beside a river. At first, Mike didn't recognize it, but once he saw the fire pit sitting between the tall trees, he realized with a sinking feeling it was the exact same campsite from years earlier. He considered mentioning it to his girlfriend, but he stopped himself. He figured maybe the fear he felt the first time had just come from being exhausted and alone in unfamiliar woods. There was really no point in worrying her over what was probably nothing. So they stayed. The evening itself was calm. They made food before dark. They sat around the fire talking until nearly midnight, and eventually they climbed into their tent. Mike admitted the place still felt a little off, but nowhere near as intense as the first visit. Then at exactly 3 a.m., both of them woke up instantly to a scream. It was not an animal. It was not a fox. It was not a coyote, and it was not an owl. Mike has camped enough to know those sounds very well. This sound was different. The scream came from somewhere in the thick brush, roughly 30 feet from their tent. What made the experience even stranger was that Mike and his girlfriend heard different things. She had described the sound like a man screaming in terror, but Mike was certain he heard words, clear as day. He thought he heard the words, "Help me." To this day, he says he knew exactly what it said before he even fully opened his eyes. Both of them sat upright immediately, frozen in silence inside the dimly lit tent. Mike's mind instantly went to the worst possible conclusion. He later said that if there was one thing that genuinely terrified him in the woods, it wasn't wild animals or ghosts. It was other people. Someone violent, possibly someone hiding in the dark wanting to hurt him or the person he was with. Hearing what sounded like a man screaming for help nearby felt like his worst camping fear had suddenly become real. At first, he thought there might be a dangerous person somewhere outside their camp. And then another thought hit him. What if someone was actually being murdered out there? He reached around in the dark, searching for his car keys. His girlfriend assumed he was reaching for his weapon, but he already had it beside him. The car was only a few feet from the tent, and his first instinct was to shut off the alarm and get inside and leave immediately. But then came the strangest part. After the scream, there was absolutely nothing. There was no crashing through the brush. There were no footsteps or snapping branches. There was literally no movement at all. Mike grabbed his weapon and a powerful flashlight before he stepped outside the tent. He swept the beam slowly through the trees and brush around the campsite, and at one point he noticed his hand shaking so badly that he had to force himself to calm down. But there was nothing there. There were no people or animals, and there was no sound. And that silence bothered him more than the scream itself. Anyone who spends enough time in the woods knows that even the smallest animal moving through leaves usually makes noise. If it had been a person, Mike felt for sure that there was no possible way someone could have disappeared through the thick brush without making a sound. Instead, it almost felt like the scream had come from nowhere at all. Eventually, he climbed back into the tent, though neither of them really slept afterwards. Mike stayed awake for the rest of the night with his head propped up, and he was listening carefully for any sound outside. Nothing else happened that night. As soon as the sun came up, they packed everything up and left the campsite. Later in the trip, once another dispersed site near Reddish Knob opened up, they moved there instead, and they had no issues whatsoever. And that difference stuck with him. Mike says he's camped all over the area before and after that night without a problem, but for whatever reason, that one particular spot always felt wrong to him in a way that he just couldn't quite explain. Over the years, he's also come across random old headstones scattered throughout that part of the forest. Typically, these are remnants of family burial sites from generations ago. Oddly enough, those never really unsettled him. In fact, he even said that he thought finding an unmarked grave would probably feel more disturbing than seeing an old headstone hidden in the woods. Still, after the screaming incident, he couldn't stop thinking about what happened. Once he got home, he started searching online for similar experiences. Most of the stories were vague accounts about strange feelings or unsettling campsites, but one post stood out to him. Another camper, this time in Dolly Sod's wilderness, which is not terribly far away, described hearing what sounded like a man screaming, "Help me," in the middle of the night, which sounds exactly like what he explained there. Mike doesn't claim what happened was paranormal. In fact, he says the possibility of it being a real person frightened him far more than the idea of ghosts or spirits. But he also admits that there's no explanation that fully makes sense. If it was a person, where did they go? Why was there no movement afterwards? Why did the sound seem to appear out of nowhere and then disappear just as suddenly? Over time, Mike has felt this odd pull to return to that campsite alone and walk around it again, though he admits he doesn't understand why. Eventually, the urge faded, and now, whenever he drives past that area, he avoids even looking towards the clearing. And if there really is something lingering out there in those woods, he believes it's probably best to do exactly what locals sometimes say you should do, which is ignore it. So, anybody have any ideas? Anybody ever been camping in the George Washington National Forest and had any strange experiences, maybe up near Reddish Knob? The Red Rock Desert surrounding Hurricane Cliffs can feel almost otherworldly at night. Vast stretches of open land, scattered brush, and complete silence make even the smallest sounds carry farther than they should. The story comes from someone we'll call Jessie. She wanted to remain anonymous. So one evening, Jessie headed out there with her boyfriend and two friends on a camping trip on the BLM land outside Hurricane, Utah. It was supposed to be a simple overnight stay, just a quiet night under the stars, surrounded by desert cliffs and open sky. The group set up camp and eventually turned in for the night, each couple sleeping in a separate tent near one another. Sometime in the middle of the night, Jessie suddenly woke up. At first, she wasn't even sure what had pulled her out of sleep, but within seconds, she realized she was hearing something moving outside the tent. Heavy footsteps, not off in the distance, right beside them. The sound was slow and deliberate, like someone pacing just outside the fabric walls only a few feet away. Jessie immediately woke her boyfriend and whispered, asking him if he had heard it too. Groggy at first, he listened for a moment before quietly admitting he did. His first thought was that it could be the wind shifting through the desert brush or maybe some kind of animal moving around camp. But the longer they listened, the less natural it sounded. These weren't quick rustling noises or the uneven movement of an animal. The footsteps sounded heavy, intentional, almost like a person circling the tent. Jessie later said she had spent her entire childhood camping, family vacations in the mountains, campgrounds, forests, and areas near national parks. She knew what tents sounded like in the wind. She knew the sounds animals made at night. And this was different. And then the fear hit her instantly. That sinking feeling in her stomach came so fast and so intensely that she knew something felt wrong before she could even explain why. Trying not to panic, Jessie texted her two friends sleeping in the nearby tent and asked if they were awake. Almost immediately, both of them responded saying they were hearing the same exact thing outside their tent too. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling explainable. Then it got stranger. Every time someone unzipped the tent or shined a flashlight outside, the footsteps stopped instantly. They didn't fade away, they stopped. The campsite would go completely silent. But the second everyone got back inside and settled down, the footsteps would start back up. They were slow and heavy, and they circled close around the camp. Eventually, all four of them got out of the tents together and searched the area with flashlights, expecting to finally find whatever had been making the noise. But there was nothing there. No animals, there were no people, there was no movement anywhere around that campsite. What unsettled them the most was the ground itself. The area around the camp was mostly sand. It was soft enough that tracks should have been obvious, but there were no footprints at all. There were no paw prints or no signs of anything that had walked around their tents. Jessie admitted that the experience terrified her enough that she eventually started praying quietly inside the tent just to calm herself down. At some point, exhaustion finally overtook the fear and she fell asleep. Her boyfriend, however, stayed awake longer. According to him, the footsteps continued even after Jessie passed out. To this day, she says she's never experienced anything else remotely like it. Not in the woods, not in the mountains, or anywhere she's camped before or since. And while she still doesn't know what was outside their tent that night in the Utah desert, she is absolutely certain that it was not normal. So, has anyone heard of anything similar happening around Hurricane Cliffs, Utah, or in general in Utah? Anybody ever camped in Utah and had an experience where you had footsteps circling your campsite all night long? If so, please let us know in the comments. Thank you. That's all for tonight's stories. A big thank you to everybody who's listening, liking, following, sharing, and showing love to the channel. And remember, if you ever find yourself alone in the woods and something out there feels wrong, trust your instincts. For now, sleep tight.